This is the beginning of the story called Sideways Stories from Wayside School. It's a little strange, so I want you to pay attention. Introduction. This book contains 30 stories about the children and the teachers at Wayside School. But before we get to them, there is something that you ought to know so that you don't get confused. Wayside School was accidentally built sideways. It was supposed to be 1 story high with 30 classrooms all in a row, but instead it is 30 stories high with 1 classroom on each story. The builder said that he was very sorry. The children at Wayside School like having a sideways school. They have an extra large playground. The children and teachers described in this book all go to the class on the very top floor, so there are 30 stories from the 30th story of Wayside School. It has been said that these stories are very strange and silly, and that is probably true. However, when I told stories about you to the children at Wayside, they thought that you were strange and silly. That is probably also true. Chapter 1. Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf had a long tongue and pointed ears. She was the meanest teacher at Wayside School. She taught the class on the 30th story. "If you children are bad," she warned, "or if you answer a problem wrong, I'll wiggle my ears, stick out my tongue, and turn you into apples." Mrs. Gorf did not like children, but she loved apples. She couldn't add. Joe couldn't add. And he couldn't even count. But he knew that if he answered a problem wrong, he would be turned into an apple, so he copied from John. He didn't like to cheat, but Mrs. Gorf had never taught him how to add. One day, Mrs. Gorf caught Joe copying John's paper. She wiggled her ears, first the right one and then the left one. She stuck out her tongue and turned Joe into an apple. And then she turned John into an apple just for letting Joe cheat. "Hey, that isn't fair," said Todd. "John was only trying to help a friend." Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first her right one and then her left, and stuck out her tongue and turned Todd into an apple. "Does anybody else have an opinion?" she asked, but nobody said a word. Mrs. Gorf laughed and placed the 3 apples on her desk. Stephen started to cry. He couldn't help it. He was scared. "I do not allow crying in my classroom," said Mrs. Gorf, so she wiggled her ears, first her right one and then her left, stuck out her tongue, and she turned Stephen into an apple. For the rest of the day, the children were absolutely quiet, and then when they went home, they were too scared to even talk to their parents. But Joe, John, Todd, and Stephen could not go home. Mrs. Gorf just left them on her desk. They were able to talk to each other, but they didn't really have much to say. Their parents were very worried. They didn't know where their children were, and nobody seemed to know. The next day, Kathy was late for school. As soon as she walked in, Mrs. Gorf turned her into an apple. Paul sneezed during class. He was turned into an apple. Nancy said, "God bless you," but she was changed into an apple. Mrs. Gorf wiggled her ears, first the right one and then her left one, stuck out her tongue. She turned them into an apple. Terence fell out of his chair. He was turned into an apple. Maurizia tried to run away. She was halfway to the door when Mrs. Gorf's right ear began to wiggle, and when she reached the door, Mrs. Gorf's left ear began to wiggle, and Maurizia opened the door and had 1 foot outside when Mrs. Gorf stuck out her tongue, and Maurizia became an apple. Mrs. Gorf picked up the apple from the floor and put it on her desk with the other apples. Then a funny thing happened. Mrs. Gorf turned around and fell over a piece of chalk. The 3 Erics laughed, and they were turned into apples. Mrs. Gorf had a dozen apples on her desk. Joe, John, Todd, Stephen, Kathy, Paul, Nancy, Terence, Maurizia, and 3 Erics, Eric Fry, Eric Bacon, and Eric Oven. Louis, the yard teacher, walked into the classroom. He had missed the children at recess. He had heard that Mrs. Gorf was a mean teacher, so he came up to investigate. He saw 12 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. "I must be wrong," he thought. She must be a good teacher if so many children bring her apples. So he walked back down to the playground. The next day, a dozen more children were turned into apples. Lewis, the yard teacher, came back into the room. He saw 24 apples on Mrs. Gorf's desk. There were only 3 children left in the class. Well, she must be the best teacher in the world, he thought. By the end of the week, all of the children were apples, and Mrs. Gorf was very happy. "Oh, now I can go home," she said. "I don't have to teach anymore. I won't have to walk up 30 flights of stairs ever again." "You're not going anywhere," shouted Todd, and he jumped off the desk and bopped into Mrs. Gorf. The rest of the apples followed. Mrs. Gorf fell on the floor, and the apple jumped all over her. "Stop! Stop!" she shouted, "or I'll turn you into applesauce." But the apples didn't stop, and Mrs. Gorf could do nothing about it. "Turn us back into children," Todd demanded. Mrs. Gorf had no choice. She stuck out her tongue, wiggled her ears, first the left one and then the right one, and turned the children back into apples. "All right," said Mauricia. "Let's go get Lewis. He'll know what to do." "No!" screamed Mrs. Gorf. "I'll turn you back into apples." She wiggled her ears, first her right one and then her left one, and stuck out her tongue. But Jenny held up a mirror, and Mrs. Gorf turned herself into an apple. The children didn't know what to do. They didn't have a teacher. Even though Mrs. Gorf was mean, they didn't think it was right to leave her as an apple, but none of them knew how to wiggle their ears. Lewis, the yard teacher, walked in. "Hey, where's Mrs. Gorf?" he asked. Nobody said a word. "Boy, am I hungry," said Lewis. "I don't think Mrs. Gorf would mind if I ate this apple. After all, she has so many." So he picked up the apple, which was really Mrs. Gorf, shined it up on his shirt, and ate it.